You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. A new survey has revealed almost half of all new mothers in the UK are not being given basic advice from health officials when it comes to breastfeeding. Psychologist John Bowlby, one of the founders of Attachment Parenting, suggests babies thrive emotionally because of the overall quality of the care they've experienced, not because of specific techniques. A bottle-fed baby whose mother is sensitively attuned will do better than a breastfed baby whose mother is mechanical and distant. Joining me in the studio to discuss when mothers should breastfeed, how long for, and whether they should choose an alternative is writer and journalist and mother of 3, Viv Groskop, and Jill Dye from La Leche League, which help mothers breastfeed through mother-to-mother support. Jill's also a mother of 3. And joining the discussion on the telephone is Sharon Trotter, who's a midwife and independent mother and baby consultant and mother of 5, and Susan Barston, who joins us from Los Angeles and is author of Bottled Up: How the Way We Feed Babies Has Come to Define Motherhood and Why It Shouldn't. So, why is the advice or support not there to help women breastfeed? And should a woman breastfeed? And what's wrong with turning towards an alternative? I'd like to start with you, please, Viv Groskop. What's your perspective?
Well, I think the most interesting element to this discussion is really about the lack of support, which the survey that you mentioned points out very clearly. And I think that the root of this huge debate, which has become extremely polarised, as you can already tell from the introductions there, is because of this lack of support. So basically, women are receiving a message generally, I mean, this is true in the UK and in the US, across the Western world really, that they should be breastfeeding, that's what's best for baby, and it's often considered to have it's proven to have health benefits for the mother as well. So they receive this message, and it's an unequivocal medical message that this is what's medically best for your child. And yet when they come to try breastfeeding, they often find that there's no one there to help them. And culturally, we've become less attuned to the whole culture of breastfeeding, that it's not so common, especially in the US, to see women feeding publicly. So often when women have their first baby, they've never actually seen anyone breastfeed a baby before. So that makes it a much more difficult thing to do, so that they need the support all the more. So a lot of women, especially when they have their first baby, they're having a baby in a culture where they're told that they absolutely must breastfeed and they're a bad mother if they don't. And yet there's no one there to help them with that. So that's where all these feelings of guilt and difficulty come from, so that when women, quite understandably, often turn to formula because there's just no other way, and they then feel very defensive about this. So from my point of view, I'd really like to see us have a culture where it's really acceptable to do whatever you want with your child, but where we also are realistic about the proven health benefits of breastfeeding. But we also accept that we're not going to be able to live up to those benefits unless the support is there for women.
That sort of coincides with the title of your book, Suzanne, Bottled Up: How the Way We Feed Babies Has Come to Define Motherhood and Why It Shouldn't.
Within this conversation, there's a lot of gaping holes that we're all ignoring. And I think the one first and foremost that I always bring up is that Norway, which, I think a lot of breastfeeding advocates hold up as a country that has done everything correctly in terms of, the resurgence of the breastfeeding culture. If you look at their breastfeeding rates, it's really quite interesting because according to 2008 statistics, while their initiation rates are up to 98% for initiating breastfeeding, which is fantastic, by 4 months, only 46% of those women are exclusively breastfeeding. And then by 6 months, that number falls to only 9%. So to me, this really tells a very interesting story about, here's a Western country that has given paid maternity and paternity leave, excellent peer support, has really turned into a breastfeeding culture, and yet women are still having these problems keeping up with this 6 months of exclusive breastfeeding mandate that WHO has put down, the World Health Organization has put down. So, to me, I feel like we're sticking to these very dogmatic viewpoints of what breastfeeding should be for, the best health outcomes. But that may be ignoring the lived realities of what women are facing today. And I think that, by doing this, we're putting all this pressure on women. And then ultimately, I think the point you made about John Bowlby is extremely important, because if we're feeling all this pressure and then we are unable to meet the recommendations, where does that leave you?
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare, and joining me in the studio to discuss breastfeeding is journalist and writer Viv Groskop, Jill Dye from La Leche League, midwife Sharon Trotter, and Susan Barston, author of Bottled Up: How the Way We Feed Babies Has Come to Define Motherhood and Why It Shouldn't. Sharon Trotter, you're a midwife and a mother and baby consultant. Are health officials failing women then in the support that they show them, that they then can't go on and continue to breastfeed, albeit for 6 months or continue for longer?
I think they are. At the end of the day, we all want the best for our babies. We all know that breastfeeding is the best for our babies, but at the end of the day, if we don't get help when we need it, and that's usually going to be in the middle of the night. Now, we've got a breastfeeding helpline in the UK, and it's available from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. It's run by volunteers, and sometimes they can't always get back to you. Parents are just not getting the support that they need. And when I say parents, I want to include fathers here, because it's almost impossible to breastfeed a baby if you haven't got a supportive partner with you. You need to have a network of people around you, preferably peer support groups. You really need to have that positive support all the time. Your self-confidence is very, very vulnerable in the first few days and weeks of breastfeeding. And with the right help and support and positive support from people, you will be able to feel more confident day by day. And every day that you produce the milk and you see your baby growing and it's because of your milk, you feel better about yourself, and it just gets easier and easier. It doesn't have to be this battle. It doesn't have to be difficult. Breastfeeding should be easy and it should be pleasurable. And there's so many negative stories in the media. Some women are so frightened that they actually don't want to start breastfeeding because they're afraid of failing, so they'd rather just not bother at all. And that's really sad. I don't want to force women to breastfeed at all. I want them to breastfeed because they want to breastfeed, and I want them to have the support at the end of the phone, at the end of the email, text, anywhere. They need the support when they need it, and they're not getting it.
Jill, you're from La Leche League, which help mothers breastfeed through support.
Yes.
So are you sort of stepping in when the health officials are failing?
I wouldn't want to say that we're stepping in when they're failing. We do pick up a lot of the pieces, but we do want to work alongside. We're all working together. We're trying to make sure that mothers get the kind of support that they need. There are 4 breastfeeding support groups in the UK, and we are one of them. We do take calls in the middle of the night, by the way. The Leche League does. I've had yes, I've had quite a few calls in the middle of the night, and usually from very desperate parents that don't have anywhere else to phone. We do have a network of support groups where mothers can get together and help get that mutual support. As the Leche League leaders, we get the calls on the phone. Some of us can visit mothers in their homes. That's not something that we can all do, but we all meet up with mothers at sort of monthly or bi-monthly group sessions. Would like not to be so much of an expert. I don't think being an expert is the right thing for anybody. I am a specialist. I'm certainly a specialist in breastfeeding. I'm a specialist in helping mothers. I don't have the right way for anybody, but I can give the information to help them make their decisions, and I can help reassure them that what they're experiencing, feeling is probably normal, and maybe with enough help, we'll get through. Hate to have it be that we're all fighting each other as mothers. I don't make the decision on whether it's okay to make formula. What I do know is babies have to be fed, and if for any reason that a mother is unable or doesn't want to breastfeed, then formula is a solution that will keep babies alive. It's not a poison, for some odd babies there are. We have had stories in the media about babies that have died because they've been given formula either because of allergies or because of bacteria in the formula. I don't say whether a mother should or shouldn't. I help her identify the situation and help her to make the decision as to whether she should supplement or not, and help her get back to breastfeeding, because that's the important thing. Many women believe that once they've given the bottle, that's it, they have to stop. Or even 2 or 3 weeks down the line, they think that it's too late for them to get back. I've helped women get back to breastfeeding several months after they've given up. It's not ever too late to at least get some breastfeeding back.
But what about the mothers who actually find it really, really hard and they can't do it and their life is becoming intolerable and it is implicating on the rest of their relationships with their family, their friends, their partner, whether they can return to work? You know, these women are becoming, in some situations, regarded as second-class citizens. Now, Susan, that's something that you can touch on with your blog.
Yeah, actually, I'd love to speak to that. Something that was said earlier about, negative stories of breastfeeding and scaring women. This is a piece of criticism I've gotten personally a lot, because one of the features of my blog is that every Friday I invite women to share the experiences they've had with infant feeding, and really it has turned into basically a series of horror stories, about struggling to breastfeed and really terrible things happening. And I do sometimes worry that this scares women off. But I also think that it's really important that we start having a freer discussion of the problems that do arise, because I think there's, a lot of miscommunication between the experts or specialists and, what women are actually experiencing. And the thing is, it's not always a physical problem that's stopping women from breastfeeding. A lot of times it is, social or emotional. And a fair amount of the women that I hear from have past sexual trauma or rape experiences, things like that, even eating disorders or OCD, situations, psychologically that make at least the beginning stages of breastfeeding very difficult. And what I always worry about is that these women are forgotten in the conversation, and it isn't necessarily a woman's responsibility to inform the lactation consultant in the hospital or the nurses or even, the peer supporters that they've been encountering what is really at the root of these problems. So when we then villainize formula and, make it so it's only appropriate in emergency situations and talk about, the very few deaths or bacterial infections that have occurred from formula, rather than giving proper education so that women are formula feeding in the correct way. Because the fact is that bacterial infections can a lot of the times be avoided by, using proper food handling, and parents are not being given this information. So I think then, ultimately what we have is a situation where women are, for personal reasons, realizing that breastfeeding is not for them. They're then being treated as if they failed. The language that we use is things like breastfeeding failure and, giving up and things like that. So then, you're already feeling like embarrassed about the fact that you're not breastfeeding, and which makes you less apt to actually ask for advice from your pediatricians or other medical professionals. So it's, then becomes the blind leading the blind, and you're, running around the internet trying to find information on how to formula feed and finding the right formula for your child. And I think, not only are we dealing with mothers who are feeling terrible about themselves, but this is also putting babies at risk, because there's a lot of mistakes that could be avoided that are being made that I've seen. So, I think it's an important thing to discuss the problems that can arise with breastfeeding and realize that sometimes they're going to not be solvable, and that, we do need to start looking at how we can help formula feeding mothers without villainizing formula or, impeding on efforts to promote breastfeeding. I think it's entirely possible to support both formula feeding and breastfeeding, and the two do not have to be at odds with each other.
So this is a mixed feeding program then? I mean, is that something that should be supported? I mean, you wrote an article, Viv, Bring on the Breastfeeding Rebellion, and you're a mother yourself.
Yeah, well, when I wrote about that, I was really looking at exactly the sort of thing that Suzanne's looking at on her blog, which is this idea that there are so many women out there who feel completely demonized, really, because they've had to give up breastfeeding. But I think what Suzanne said is so interesting there, because it's really this very, very tense and difficult point that we've got to, where we want to make it okay to use formula, but we also want to promote breastfeeding at the same time, and that's virtually impossible. Jill's shaking her head at this. It is impossible, because the reality is, I don't want women to, or parents, because somebody's already said, it's not just about mothers. The fathers have opinions about this too, and they can help with breastfeeding, and they can help with overcoming the difficulties of breastfeeding. We want to show the facts to parents, and the facts are, medically, breastfeeding is the best thing. This is, there are various people who have attempted to disprove this, but so far I haven't seen anything that's really believable along those lines. But, it's medically the best thing. So we have to look at the scientific facts and say, what's healthy and best for baby? It's breastfeeding. And yet we have this problem. So how do we balance those two things? Because by making formula feeding more acceptable, we are then encroaching on a culture where I believe breastfeeding actually hasn't really become that acceptable yet. I mean, there's a sort of double discourse going on here, where we're saying, oh yeah, it's so bad if you don't breastfeed. In reality, if you do breastfeed, certainly in the UK, you still get teased about it. You'll be completely vilified if you do it beyond 6 months. You'll be seen as a total freak if you do it up to 2 or 3 years. And a really interesting, what Suzanne mentioned, the figures about Norway, where breastfeeding is hugely accepted. And when a child is 6 months, there's only 9% of mothers still exclusively breastfeeding. That's in Norway. So we already have this very strange culture where we're pretending that breastfeeding is really accepted and that everyone's doing it, and it's just so great, and you're totally vilified if you don't do it. But in reality, that's not exactly what's going on.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Joining me in the studio to discuss breastfeeding is journalist and writer Viv Groskop, who wrote an article entitled Let the Breastfeeding Rebellion Begin, and Jill Dye from La Leche League, which help mothers breastfeed through mother-to-mother support, and midwife Sharon Trotter, who's a mother and baby consultant, and Suzanne Barston, author of Bottled Up, How the Way We Feed Babies Has Come to Define Motherhood and Why It Shouldn't. Sharon.
It's really upsetting to hear this, because this is just not the truth. Breastfeeding is not really accepted as the best way to feed your baby. It should be. We shouldn't even be talking about this. And as for getting information about bottle feeding, it's everywhere. You've got follow-on milk products being advertised on the television, which really are using exactly the same marketing as they would for the first milks, which they're not allowed to do because of the code of practice. But really, it's a way of getting people to use the formula milks, and they're really not necessary. We really don't need to introduce follow-on milks at all. So I don't really think that it's right that we're saying that there's lots of information about breastfeeding and not enough on bottle feeding, because there's loads of information out there on bottle feeding, and it should just be the norm that we just breastfeed. The important thing here is that we're not giving parents enough support when they need it. Things can be turned around in a minute. I absolutely agree. You can start breastfeeding again a few weeks, a few months after you've stopped breastfeeding, and people just don't realise that you can relactate. If you've got the support, you can breastfeed. There's almost no reason at all, and there are millions of babies around the world that are dying because of not breastfeeding. We're in a culture where everything is clean, we've got clean water, we can make feeds up okay. There's not really the same risk. So what we're talking about here is maybe not so true, but in the rest of the world, lots of babies, yes, they are dying of not breastfeeding, and babies are saved from all manner of problems throughout the rest of their life, never mind the emotional and the psychological positive benefits to breastfeeding. So, we should be promoting it more, not less, definitely.
We're very much we have a problem in part because breastfeeding is associated with mothering, and to some extent La Leche League, because of part of the philosophy is mothering through breastfeeding, because we believe it's the most effective and most natural way of being a good mother. And I think it is, because you've got biology on your side that you've got hormones that help you to be more tolerant, more in tune with your baby. But that doesn't mean you can't learn to do that so that you can be a good mother without breastfeeding. But as Viv said, the scientific evidence is so strong, we should be at least giving the information to everybody, and rather than trying to deny, it's something that's good to do.
Suzanne, breastfeeding is defined as being a good mother. How does that make you feel?
That honestly, that really worries me, because I won't say angers, because I've been dealing with this for 3 years. I'm sort of almost past it emotionally, but what worries me there is, like, okay, so for instance, in my situation, and I do write a lot about what I went through, because I think that's important. A lot of people, we aren't talking about our personal experiences. We're talking in these blanket statements, and I was someone who did have severe postpartum depression that was extremely linked to breastfeeding. And, look, I'm not going to say biologically it absolutely does not make sense that breastfeeding, exacerbates postpartum depression. But breastfeeding pressure does. And I've seen this time and time again, and the thousands of women I've talked to and interviewed. I think that, again, if you are having a positive experience and you're someone who went in wanting to breastfeed and things are working and you have proper support and you don't have any physical impediments to doing it, then yes, breastfeeding is a great way to bond with your baby. But so many women are having problems, and I think, we're essentially like sticking our heads in the sand here to try to compare what's going on in third world countries or what's gone on in the past to what's going on now. And to say that with support every woman can breastfeed, I just think that's patently false. To me, it's like we haven't done proper research to say, with full confidence that breastfeeding problems aren't on the rise physically. We just don't know. And so then, we're turning around and telling women that, mothering and breastfeeding is so linked. I just don't think that's true, and I think a lot of that is coming from the mouths of people who have never bottle fed or have had bottle fed in duress and not wanted to. In any situation where a woman does not want to breastfeed, bottle feeding is going to be preferable. I think that, yes, you are absolutely right that in third world countries with the lack of clean water, bottle feeding can be a death sentence, and I would never, ever say that it is a better choice in that situation. But I think if you're talking about, developed countries with good resources, good water, good health care, you are talking about very incremental differences.
What has a greater effect on society? The woman who feels awful for not being able to breastfeed and has chosen to give her baby formula and then lives to regret it, or the baby who grows up having not had the 6 months attachment parenting and breastfed and has been given formula from day one. Do you want to hear again from Sharon Trotter, who's a baby and mother consultant?
I get this from people all the time. They speak to me 20, 30, 40 years after not breastfeeding, and they're still feeling guilty, and they're still wishing that they were given the help that they needed and consistent advice that would really make a difference to them. Simple things like, yes, it's okay to feed every hour on the hour. We're always telling people, you're feeding the baby too much, you're spoiling your baby too much, you're making a rod for your own back. Give your baby a bottle of formula in the evening to make it easier for you. All these things, at the beginning of the end of breastfeeding, it's all about supply and demand. And if we were just there and we support people and give them the help they need when they need it, you're absolutely right, Suzanne. You do not need to breastfeed to be a good mother. Of course, if you're in a good place and you're giving your baby all the support that they need, they're going to be absolutely fine feeding on formula, especially in this society where we can do it safely. But there's so many people that miss out on the pleasure of breastfeeding, and it ends up being a battle. We all need help with the transition to parenthood, and that's what it is. It's a transition to parenthood. It's not breastfeeding that causes all the problems. We always end up blaming breastfeeding because in those early weeks, everything is just so difficult. It's such a big change to your whole life, and we end up demonizing the breastfeeding when really it's not that. It's just the transition to parenthood. So we just need to be there more for parents. We do all want the same things, and we do all agree on this. I wouldn't want to force anybody to do anything, but the long-term repercussions of this do go on for much more than just a few weeks or a few months. People regret it for a lot longer than that, and they won't get that chance again. So we need to make sure women get the support they need when they need it.
Well, what's the government doing then? You know, New York, they suggest that from September, some private hospitals and city hospitals will restrict the access to formula milk, in that mothers who are just being discharged won't be given the goodie bag which has formula milk samples in it. That's going to be stopped from September. What do we hear from the government in the UK?
We haven't had a great deal of help from this government for some time, even with new babies from the leaders of each party. What was in the media was about what formula one leader's wife was giving to the baby. Another one is getting up and bottle feeding the baby. So in their personal lives, they were obviously not choosing breastfeeding. And that's not any kind of criticism from their partners' wives, because their choice is completely, but government is to do what they want to. But government policy is to support breastfeeding in name, so they shouldn't have been doing things to undermine it at the time. There was no money for Breastfeeding Awareness Week this year. There wasn't even in the end a theme. They did take place. There were various things going, but nothing very much, and a lot of negative press, because there's always negative stories that come out around National Breastfeeding Week and around World Breastfeeding Week, which I suspect is probably one of the reasons we've had some of these articles in August, because it's the first week in August that is World Breastfeeding Week. We haven't had goodie bags with formula for some years in the UK.
I was really shocked that they
still have them.
In the
Yeah,
US.
absolutely. And some hospitals are requiring mothers to bring in their own formula if they're choosing to formula feed. We have not had revolution in the streets. We have not meant that this has not meant that women's right to choose formula has been in any way questioned, and they do have formula in wards for babies that need it. If their mothers intend to breastfeed and they need support.
There's questions that the media have a responsibility in educating mothers, the public, as to what they should do, or perhaps not being party to vilifying women who formula feed to become second-class citizens.
I don't personally really agree with this idea that the media have vilified breastfeeding. You know, personally, I've written so many articles supporting women about breastfeeding. I just think you've got to choose what you read carefully.
And when?
Yes. The real issue here is to do with it's this whole thing of support, and that without this support, nobody's going to get anything. And you mentioned what are the government here doing? Well, they're cutting back on midwife numbers. And that's where it starts, you know, the very, very first moment of birth. You know, that's where we start with breastfeeding support. And if we don't even have the right number of midwives, then it's a disaster. And the US, you know, absolutely even more problems, because they've got one of the highest caesarean rates in the world, which makes breastfeeding more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult. So everything is going in the direction of less support.
Can I just say that midwives and health visitors get just a few hours training in breastfeeding support during their training. And it's not because I'm a midwife that I can help people with breastfeeding. It's because I've been a breastfeeding mother for 7 years. It's a fallacy to think that you're going to get the help and the support you need from the healthcare professionals. What we need are breastfeeding supporters that understand how breastfeeding works, and they need to be in the hospital, and they need to be there 24/7 so that people can go to them the minute they have a problem. It's too late if they've been left 3 or 4 hours in the corner and they're pulling their hair out and they're crying. They really need that support, and that's what they're not getting. And they want to get home, so they go to the formula and they use the formula so that they can get out of hospital because they're so distressed, and that should not be happening.
I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on The Voice of Russia in London. Jill Dye from La Leche League, midwife Sharon Trotter there, who's also a mother and baby consultant, Susan Barston in Los Angeles, author of Bottled Up, How the Way We Feed Babies Has Come to Define Motherhood and Why It Shouldn't, and journalist and writer Viv Goskop, who wrote an article entitled Let the Breastfeeding Rebellion Begin. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. A new survey has revealed almost half of all new mothers in the UK are not being given basic advice from health officials when it comes to breastfeeding. Psychologist John Bowlby, one of the founders of attachment parenting, suggests babies thrive emotionally.
An equivocal medical message that this is what's medically best for your child. And yet when they come to try breastfeeding, they often find that there's no one there to help them. And culturally, we've become less attuned to the whole culture of breastfeeding, that it's not so common, especially in the US, to see women feeding publicly. So often when women have their first baby, they've never actually seen anyone breastfeed a baby before. So that makes it a much more difficult thing to do, so that they need the support all the more. So a lot of women, especially when they have their first baby, they're having a baby in a culture
because of the overall quality of the care they've experienced, not because of specific techniques. A bottle-fed baby whose mother is sensitively attuned will do better than a breastfed baby whose mother is mechanical and distant. Joining me in the studio to discuss when mothers should breastfeed, how long for, and whether they should choose an alternative is writer and journalist and mother of 3, Viv Groskop, and Jill Dye from La Leche League, which help mothers breastfeed through mother-to-mother support. Jill's also a mother of 3. And joining the discussion
to this discussion is really about the lack of support, which the survey that you mentioned points out very clearly. And I think that the root of this huge debate, which has become extremely polarised, as you can already tell from the introductions there, is because of this lack of support. So basically, women are receiving a message generally, I mean, this is true in the UK and in the US, across the Western world really, that they should be breastfeeding, that that's what's best for baby, and it's often considered to have, it's proven to have health benefits for the mother as well. So they receive this message, and it's an...
On the telephone is Sharon Trotter, who's a midwife and independent mother and baby consultant and mother of 5, and Susan Barston, who joins us from Los Angeles and is author of Bottled Up: How the Way We Feed Babies Has Come to Define Motherhood and Why It Shouldn't. So, why is the advice or support not there to help women breastfeed? And should a woman breastfeed? And what's wrong with turning towards an alternative? I'd like to start with you, please, Viv Groskop. What's your perspective?
Well, I think the most interesting element